Welcome everyone to Straight Science. Straight Science is a evening seminar series put on by University of Alaska Fairbanks Northwest Campus in Nome and also University of Alaska Fairbanks Alaska Sea Grant in Nome. And tonight I'm not in Nome, but we are bringing it to you from Anchorage. And before we begin, this Straight Science, I'm really excited about the timing. Right now, Nome is celebrating the 100th anniversary of the diphtheria run in 1925 that put many of the sled dogs kind of in the history books and some of the mushers in the history books for rescuing the people of Nome, bringing diphtheria medicine to the region. So before we begin, I just want to say that the Serum Run Week in Nome is for this Great Race of Mercy. That's what it was called, the Great Race of Mercy. It was right now, and it actually, they sort of came into town, what would be, I think, February 2nd, so Monday, maybe. And there were, just to hit on that topic, for the Great Race of Mercy, they had some Inupiaq children that had died of diphtheria. There were more people getting sick in Nome. And the news went out, we need medicine. The only way in at this time of year was going to be dogs. And there were 20 mushers and about 150 sled dogs. And in 5.5 days, they covered about 675 miles in some of the worst dead of winter conditions, not like right now, what we're experiencing in Alaska, but really some brutal, brutal conditions. There are 3 dogs. I'm just going to mention them because this is the Serum Run Week. We have Balto. He's kind of the famous guy. There's sort of the 3. The famous guy is Balto. They made the movies. He got the statue. He came across the finish line. Good for him. But it was Togo who actually, and I think I looked it up, Balto, not to take away from his fame, but he did 55 miles, whereas Togo and his co-brother, Fritz, did 260 miles, just saying. And they had some of the most dangerous part of the trail. All of these dogs belong to Seppala, and Seppala is the musher that went through the horrific longest part of the trail. And Togo is, he's kind of the dog that did the danger with his co-brother. And Fritz, if anyone's in Nome or headed to Nome, you can actually see Fritz in our museum. He's stuffed, and we can all go and look at Fritz if you so desire. But so the race it wasn't a race, it was a race of mercy, and it began on the 24th and ended on February 2nd. So Nome is celebrating that. That's what was going on 100 years ago. I did a quick look at that. It seemed like people want to say those were Siberian Huskies. I'm no dog expert, but what we're going to talk about in celebration of the Serum Run is actually the indigenous dog, the oldest known breed. Now, this breed, although the Siberian Husky and these speakers will be able to tease this out for us, as lauded as that and fantastic as that race is, the indigenous Arctic dog is the one who's been really adapted to the Arctic conditions and has been around as a workhorse and friend and true Arctic partner for thousands of years. And our speakers tonight, we're excited, are Chris Darwent. She is a professor of archaeology at the University of California, Davis, and also Sarah Brown, who is an environmental scientist and geneticist at the California Department of Water Resources. And that's curiosity right there for me. And so I'm excited to turn now from the Serum Run and dive into truly the dog. And I believe you're going to tell us about your whole Arctic analysis and more about the sort of really legendary and true Arctic partner for us and whole Arctic. With that, we're so grateful you're here. Take it away. We can't wait to hear about the dogs.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm so excited to be here and to be chatting with Chris about subjects that are very near and dear to our hearts. So yeah, we'll be talking about friends in high places, the evolutionary history of Arctic dogs. Before we start, I just wanted to recognize some of our co-authors. We'll mainly be talking about a paper we published in 2019, Specialized Sledge Dogs Accompanied Inuit Dispersal Across the North American Arctic and Proceedings of the Royal Society. You can see we have quite an interdisciplinary group from um, many different universities across the world. It was a pretty incredible team to be able to work with. And so with our outline, just going to talk very briefly about dogs in North America and some of the past research. And then Chris will talk about Inuit dogs and Inuit culture as well. Then we'll go over some of the goals of the study, methods, and then results and conclusions, and then questions as they come as well. And I want to mention too that most of these dog pictures here are pictures that my sister took when she was a vet in Iditarod, like in 2018, I think. So it's nice to be able to share those amazing pictures that she took. So before we dig into our research and the Inuit culture, I'm going to just briefly describe some past research elucidating the history of dogs in North America. So dogs were domesticated from wolves about between 40,000 to 15,000 years ago, and the exact where and when of that is still pretty unknown, which is pretty amazing. It's a really complicated domestication, and it's showing it with the genetics and archaeological work as well. And so since that original domestication event or events, dogs then disseminated across the globe, and we first see that dogs appeared, or the first wave of dogs into the Americas was roughly 17,000 years ago with the first indigenous peoples. And then following that, we see about 5,000 years ago, people and their dogs potentially moved in with the pre-Inuit migration. Following that, we have the Inuit migration about 1,000 years ago. And then from AD 1492 and onwards, we also have the introduction of dogs from European colonists. And then as early as 1900s, more recent introductions of husky dogs, and with a lot of interbreeding with European breed dogs as well. Okay. You'll see here that a lot of our focus is going to be on the second and the third waves for our research. Now it's pretty interesting. So despite the fact that humans first arrived in the Americas around 1700 years ago, 17,000 years ago, excuse me, 1700. The oldest confirmed dog remains are in North America, or in Illinois. So this red site down here, the Coster site in Illinois, and those remains are dated to about 10,000 years old. And we see a smattering of other dog remains. Some of the second oldest would be the Hines Cave in Texas, about 9,000 years old. Dust Cave, Alabama, 8,000 or so. In Newfoundland, 4,000. And then some additional samples from Zilkov Island in Russia, about 9,000 years old. And so it's thought that even though humans arrived 17,000 years ago, that there was potentially a second pulse of humans around 11,500 years ago, that they took an ice-free path through the Great Plains, and they were able to bring dogs with them. And so there's some suggestions perhaps that dogs might not have come over on some of those first trips. So work from a 2018 paper in Science helped kind of elucidate some of the origins of dogs in North America. And this is a map of the samples that they used in their paper. Um, and they sequenced 71 mitochondrial genomes from these ancient dogs, some again ranging back to 10,000 years old, which is quite a feat in the world of ancient DNA. It's pretty amazing. And so these red circles, or for these red sites, indicate that they're 10,000 years, around 10,000 years and slightly younger. The yellow is 7 to 5,000 years old. And then the light blues are 2,000 to 1,000 or so. And so what the authors found was that all pre-Columbian dogs, so the red circles, that they are most closely related to dogs from Zhukov Island in Siberia. And all of these pre-Columbian dogs share common ancestors, roughly 14,600 years ago, and they diverged from the Zhukov Island dogs about 15,600 years ago, which is coincident with human arrivals onto North America. So it's thought that dogs were brought several thousand years after the first humans arrived, since the earliest archaeological record is 10,000 years old. And I know that there's often questions about, like, oh, did they originate from North American wolves? And there was no evidence of that in this paper or in other research as well, that they are derived from Eurasian wolves and then have moved over into North America. And unfortunately now, though, that pre-Columbian genetic lineage of dogs is extinct. Let me hold on. And so of the samples that were analyzed from the Arctic, there was only a few that fall within this pre-Columbian dog clade or group. And however, the modern dogs did not group in with these pre-Columbian dogs. So this leaves the question of, where did these dogs come from and what were their ancestors? And so that will lead us to our research. But so we know now that the pre-contact dogs are closely related. They're closely related to modern Arctic dogs, but not the direct ancestor. And so the question that we have is, what is the ancestor of modern Arctic dogs? And that is the focus of our research. And like I said, to that end, we'll be focusing our attentions on the second and third waves, the pre-Inuit and Inuit migrations of humans and their canines. And then I'm going to let Chris take it away and talk about Inuit culture.
Yeah, so I just wanted to give folks just a little bit of a background as to how Sarah and I connected. So I was mentioning this to Gabe just before we started. So as you know, I'm a professor of archaeology in California, although I'm originally from Western Canada. And Sarah was actually started out in ecology and then moved into doing to the Department of Veterinary Genetics. And it was here that she kind of came to me when she was working on her PhD on dogs, looking at kind of contemporary dog populations in northeastern and northwestern Asia, and said, you know, hey, could we look at dogs? Do you have any dogs that we could look at that are like ancient dogs? And it happened to be that her father had done some archaeological research, or at least took an archaeological field school way back when with my colleague next door. So we had kind of multiple levels of connections. And so at the time that we started this project, I was actually working on two different projects on either side of the Arctic that happened to be funded by NSF at the same time. So it was like a bounty of riches in terms of the archaeological research that was happening at that moment. And so it kind of came together that way. And in addition to what I will be talking about of some of the archaeological research that I've personally worked on, Sarah and I visited museums in all various parts of Canada, the Alaska, the Rhode Island, for where Gay is from, as well as Copenhagen in Denmark. So we traveled all over the place and eventually collected well over 600 dog samples, of which the DNA that was extracted from it was maybe about 300 or so of those samples that formed our portion of the project. And then our collaborators that she was talking about contributed another several hundred samples to create this very large data set that we looked at for Inuit dogs in the Arctic. So, so these two waves of migration that we're talking about are pre-Inuit and Inuit, and they are genetically related to each other. The humans are genetically related to each other, but it is a distant relationship in the Bering Strait region more broadly. So about 5,000 years ago, you have smaller populations that have, again, very limited cultural and genetic connection to contemporary Inuit, but they're obviously much more connected to contemporary Inuit than to any other populations in the greater region. So they did have dogs, but they had much fewer dogs than what we see coming later with Inuit populations. And so most archaeologists speculate that these were hunting companion dogs and definitely not sled dogs. We don't have any evidence of dog sledding. We do have some evidence for small hand-pulled sleds, but nothing like what we see much later on. So at about 1,000 years ago, roughly or so, we see this massive migration out of the Bering Strait region, kind of across the North Slope and into the Canadian Arctic and all the way across to Greenland, of much, much larger populations. And these folks are the direct cultural and genetic ancestors to contemporary Inuit populations, which include Inupiaq and Yupik populations in Alaska. So these are folks who were whale hunters, had large umiaks or large boats that could hold multiple passengers for hunting. Oh, thanks for changing that for me, Sarah. And so they used both dogs and sleds as well as these large boats for transport and hunting. This was a very different kind of cultural adaptation to the Arctic than what we saw previously in terms of kind of the scale of cooperation in large whale hunting, but also in this use of dogs as teams for transporting people. What we found with pre-Inuit populations is that although there were dogs with the initial wave of people, 5,000 to 4,000 or so years ago, by about 1,000 years ago, we have no dogs from any of the archaeological sites. They've like disappeared, and so it seems that there was kind of definitely a genetic bottleneck that originally happened, and then they probably just died out. So this new wave that came in, which is somewhat related, and Sarah will talk more about that, is a kind of a different population. So go on to the next slide. So Arctic archaeological field research that I mentioned. So the field work that I've been working on, as I said, on kind of two separate sides of the Arctic. I actually originally started my Arctic field work back in 1992 to 1995 in a little tiny spot in the very middle of that blue section of the map, a place called Little Cornwallis Island. Yeah, go up even higher with your cursor. Keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. Right around there-ish. Oops, down. So way high up. And so I fell in love with the Arctic on that first field season. I then did work for the National Park Service in 1998 and worked at a place called that everyone in Alaska is probably familiar with, which is Cape Krusenstern. And then once I was hired at UC Davis, just shortly after completing my PhD, I connected with my colleague who was a postdoc when I was an undergraduate at the University of Calgary, and we initiated this project called the Inglefield Land Archaeology Project in northwestern Greenland, which went from between 2004 and 2016 was the last field season that we had up in this area, that involved extensive helicopter, foot, and boat survey, as well as excavation in 3 different locations. And it was from here that we were able to obtain dog samples for Sarah's project. At the same time, as you can see the overlapping dates, we ended up, I was collaborating with 2 other archaeologists in Alaska. So I was the primary zooarchaeologist and the person that was also overseeing all of the faunal collections from Cape Espenberg, Alaska. And that project went from initially in 2007, but primarily 2010 and 2011 was our collection. And most recently, my husband and I, John Darwent, as well as our graduate students, have been working in the Qimmiq area, which includes excavations at Cape Denby at Ayadayat. And then more recently, we were actually in 2019, we collected fish samples from Cape Denby, but from a slightly different site. So we've been collaborating with the Qimmiq Native Corporation for a while, but we don't have as many dog samples that we were able to give to Sarah because we were actually wrapping up the lab research portion of that project. But we do have samples that came from not Qimmiq, but from Cape Denby that are in our project database. So next, yeah. Okay, so I wanted to just give you a little bit about northwestern Greenland, just to tell you a little bit about dogs in northwestern Greenland, because it looks a little different than what we think of with the Iditarod dog sled teams, and definitely of Indigenous dogs. So so teams were much smaller. You would have teams of maybe 3 to 4 dogs. You can see in the painting that was done in 1818. And this was John Ross, who was a whaler, a British whaler, had come up into a place called Prince Regent's Bay. But these are the Inuit, which is a slightly different dialect of Inuit in northwestern Greenland. And what they collected at that time were a number of artifacts, which are actually on exhibit at the Scott Polar Institute in Cambridge that I visited this summer, and saw this little sled. And this is a dog sled, and it is made entirely out of things like walrus ribs, walrus tusks, walrus baculum, as the penis bones, for those who are unaware, as well as pieces of ivory that are lining the sled runners. What's really interesting is today in northwestern Greenland, those little pieces of ivory have been replaced by little pieces of plastic that line the sled runners, but they function in exactly the same way. And we find the same kind of curls of ivory and curls of plastic that kind of littering the landscape in northwestern Greenland from sled dogs. Next. So American polar expeditions to the Arctic were what we were originally focusing on with our work in northwestern Greenland, because we knew that dogs were integral to Inuit life in the Arctic. We know that Robert Perry, during his polar expeditions, along with Matthew Henson, used Inuit dogs for their sled run to the pole. We won't get into whether or not they actually found the exact spot of the pole, but they were close. And this continued with other polar expeditions by Donald McMillan, which is where all of these photographs that you see here came from. These are all hand-tinted, hand-painted lantern slides from the site of Etah, which is where we excavated in 2006, 2007, and then went back again in 2012 and 2016. So you can see this little girl, Shui Gingwa, holding a little Inuit dog puppy, and you can also see them going along the ice foot with the sled dogs and their teams there. Next. So Inuit sled dogs, as I've kind of alluded to, the name in Inuktitut is Qimmiq, and I'm not sure if everyone is aware, but the emblem of Nunavut, so the territory in Canada, it's not a polar bear. It's a sled dog. And so the sled dog is so closely tied to Inuit life and Inuit culture in Canada that it is part of their territorial flag emblem, as well as like their kind of main animal. And you can see how they would hook up the dogs with the bearded sealskin harness, and they had these little crescent-shaped toggles, and that allowed them to kind of create this fan hitch, which was the style of running dogs, because that was actually much safer when you're running over large swaths of Arctic ice. And that way, if a dog got kind of tangled up, you could actually release the dog for good or for bad. Sometimes dogs ended up going into the water, but this is a way to save the entire team and not have everyone fall through. In Qimmiq, which is the closest large Inuit village or Nukut village where we work, they still use, and in Sarapaluk as well, they still use dogs. They do not use motorized snowmobiles. It's actually banned by the Inuit community there. That was their decision to make sure that their dog sledding way of life was retained. And they did that also in part because sled dogs are safer than snowmobiles out on ice, because the dogs can sense when there's cracks in the snow. So, Qimmiqs. So the Inglefield Land Archaeology Project, we obtained dog samples from this site called Qaqatsut, as well as from Etah. And you can see some of the pictures from our excavations there. And then I'll go into the next slide there, Sarah. So I want to tell you a little bit of a tale of one of the sites where our dog samples came from, and I call it one very desperate winter that happened 600 years ago. So 28% of the bones in this little house, that it's a stone house structure. So the houses were made out of stone and blocks of sod or turf to create kind of an igloo looking structure. And this is the tunnel entrance that you're seeing at the front of the picture that extends into the house. And off to the side to the right is a little alcove, and that in that alcove is their kind of kitchen area. Yep, just right below there, Sarah. Yep, right there, perfect. And the bones of the dog were all concentrated in this kitchen alcove, as well as we found parts of the dog in a nearby food cache. In the middle photograph of the dog mandible there, you'll see there's a broken piece, and that broken piece was found in the house, and the rest of the mandible was found in the cache. So we were actually able to refit them together to know that these two events were linked. But you can see that the dogs, they were breaking open the mandibles to get the fat out of the bone. They were breaking off the tops of the skulls, as you can see in the top photo there, to get the brains out to consume. And based on my analysis, at least 7 dogs were consumed. So this would have been, if not an entire single sled dog team, most likely 2 sled dog teams. That would have been incredibly desperate to eat your entire sled dog team. So something must have gone terribly wrong for the family that lived there. We did not find any burials anywhere around, so it doesn't seem like that the humans that succumbed there, but their entire team did. And so these dogs became part of our study. Next. So on the other side of the Arctic, as I said, I had 2 projects going on. Cape Espenberg Archaeology Project. The houses look very, very different. Instead of being built out of stone and sod, they were built out of driftwood and sod. And you can see in the lower left photograph there, these are actually the floorboards that remain. And this back part here, where you see these little posts sticking up, was actually the sleeping platform that people slept on. But the structure of the houses, the overall shape of the houses, are actually identical to the ones that you see in Greenland, because they are connected culturally and genetically. And so kind of their way of life is actually very similar from one side of the Arctic to the other. And you can see here some of our other samples. There's the dog skull kind of in the middle is the same dog skull that's poking out of the ground that we collected. And this was found in the tunnel of one of the houses that we were excavating. And you can see how this dog died, which is often very common. We see this in lots of dogs across the Arctic, is that when they go to kind of dispatch the dog, you go from behind and you're usually hitting it on one side of the skull. And that was kind of, a quick blow to the dog, and they would be put down. Most of these dogs, though, with the exception of that tale that I told you, most of the dogs that were intentionally put down were often older dogs, and we often find dogs that have a lot of, tooth loss and resorption. So these were dogs that had kind of already had a tough and long, and very useful life to their owners. Next. So I wanted to briefly mention Inuit culture and dogs, and what really inspired me to collaborate with Sarah on this project. So while Sarah and I were kind of thinking about this research, I happened to be on sabbatical at Bowdoin College in Maine. And while I was there working with my colleague on the Inglefield Land Project, Sheila Watcloutier, who is a very well-known Inuit activist from the Central Canadian Arctic, she was also on a research as a visiting scholar there. So we spent quite a bit of time talking about what I did and what she did. And she said, Chris, you need to pursue this project because it's really important to Inuit people that these dogs that are so important to our identity and our culture, that people know the story that these dogs came with us and they are part of us. And also that this picture in the bottom here, taken in 1953, this is just prior to a devastating event in Canada where the RCMP killed many, many of the dogs in these communities as a way to keep Inuit people from continuing to live out on the land. They were trying to make sure that they stayed in their villages where the schools were being set up by the Canadian government and, clinics and post offices and so forth. Very similar tale to Alaska. Yep.
Chris, this is Gay.
Yep.
You might want to, the acronym RCMP may not be common
Sorry.
to us.
Oh, right. Sorry.
Thank you.
Americans. Yes. So the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Thank you. So the Royal Canadian Mounted Police were the ones that killed the dogs. And this came out in what was known as the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of the Canadian government, that they acknowledged the devastation that this caused. And it was Sheila's kind of giving me the, like, use the science to prove this ancestry. So I'm now going to pass it back to Sarah to tell us about this ancestry.
Thanks, Chris. As always, it's amazing to hear all of that history. Just go over some of the questions that we were focused on. So what are the relationships of ancient Inuit dogs and the pre-Inuit dogs to those pre-contact dogs that I talked about from that 2018 paper? And then did ancient Inuit dogs derive from pre-Inuit dogs? Don't know. Are modern Inuit dogs descended from ancient Inuit dogs? So lots of questions about ancestry here. And our project essentially was like a little 23andMe or Ancestry.com for dogs. So we decided to use ancient DNA rather than focusing on modern dogs for the study, because in some of the work from my PhD had shown that modern dogs, they've gone through several pretty incredible bottlenecks, and so their genetic ancient genetic signature from wolves is fairly. Hold on, I have a cat that needs to come in here. Hold on one second.
While she's letting her cat in, let me just answer.
Yeah, there's a chat.
Yeah, no, let me
saying,
answer Kristen's question here of what frame is pre-contact. And
yeah,
so what we're
thank you.
meaning is pre-European contact, and that actually differs depending on where in the Arctic that you're standing. So where I was talking about in northwestern Greenland, that was one of the latest contacts in the Arctic of 1818. So we're really though talking about probably like earlier than the 1700s.
All right, thank you very much, Chris. This is Gay. You good, Sarah?
I'm good. She's
All right, continue.
she's right here. Okay. Yeah, so ancient DNA, well, I gotta save her from falling off the table. Ancient DNA offers a direct view to the past, and particularly ancient DNA has been around for the past 30 or so years. And in the time frame that I was starting my postdoc with Chris, the genetic techniques for extracting DNA and being able to sequence it were really just skyrocketing and becoming cheaper and easier to use. And so it was the right place at the right time to be able to use this amazing window into the past. It was just incredibly amazing. And so some of the samples that we had ranged from 9,000 to 150 years old. I don't think ours, the samples that I extracted, they weren't 9,000 years old. The part of our team did those samples. But here's an example of some of the samples that we collected from museums. And so Chris and I both sorted through thousands of bones to find needles in haystacks. And even like as Chris mentioned, my dad was an archaeology major. He came along with me on one of our trips to the Canadian Museum of History now, right? Not civilization. So it was pretty amazing.
Sarah, let me just point out that in the bottom bottom right corner, that is from St. Lawrence Island, that
Oh.
particular sample. So for folks in listening from the Nome region.
So like Chris mentioned, we were able to either receive samples from museums or be able to go and sort through their bones there. And so the old name, Canadian Museum of Civilization, now it's the Museum of History. We have to go to Copenhagen to get some of the older samples. And then Maxwell Museum of Anthropology in New Mexico, Haffenreffer, University of Alaska Museum of the North in Fairbanks, and then Prince of Wales Northern Heritage Center. And then in addition to the samples that Chris had collected from her archaeological sites. And so here's an example, or not an example, here is the map of all of our samples that ended up working, that we got DNA from. And this is combined from both our work and our collaborators from the different universities. And so you can see the different colors here. So the light blue purple is the Siberian Holocene. So that's 47 samples. The pink is the pre-Inuit, and that's 92 samples. The green right in here and in Greenland are the Inuit, 289, and then historic Arctic, 171 samples. And I think all in all, we had like 900 samples with all of our groups, and then 630 of them worked, which again, with ancient DNA samples, it's incredible. A pretty incredible data set. And so this is me in an ancient DNA lab. As soon as an animal dies, the DNA starts degrading and it gets broken into small little pieces that's susceptible to DNA damage. And so the DNA that is sloughing off of me, or the DNA that I would bring in from my cat and my dog, are potentially huge risks of contamination. And so we had a clean lab that we would clean with high concentration bleach and try to be as absolutely clean as possible in order to prevent contamination of these samples. And so adhered to a strict ancient DNA protocol, wearing Tyvek suits, double gloving, bleaching everything. Like I said, we had about 910 ancient samples. And we extracted the DNA and processed them for mitochondrial genome sequencing. So we were aiming for about 16,000 or so base pairs, which is, again, in ancient DNA, that's a pretty big ask, because the DNA degrades so quickly and it breaks up into little tiny pieces. So we essentially had to find ways of sequencing that DNA where we would have many copies of it, so that we could make sure that we got what we think we were getting. And I just want to mention too that we used mitochondrial DNA instead of nuclear DNA, because you have 4 times more mitochondrial genomes, DNA in your cells, rather than nuclear DNA. And so it's a lot easier for ancient DNA to get mitochondrial DNA. Okay. And so, like I was talking about with kind of doing the 23andMe for these ancient dogs, our results showed that there was essentially 4 major groups, 4 maternal haplotypes of these Arctic dogs. And so the first is this group here in purple. Sorry, my cat is trying to get back out again. It's called A2B, and that has the pre-contact dogs that I was talking about before from that 2018 paper, and then pre-Inuit dogs, so that dogs that would have come over 5,000 years, and so on. And then the second group is A2A, that contains Inuit dogs from both Canada and Greenland. And then group A1B, that has East Asian dogs, dingoes, and Siberian dogs. And then A1A has modern dogs. And that's just represented kind of by huskies. Okay, and then I think this next slide, this is my favorite, because you get to see a snapshot in time for each of these panels here. And so if we start off with this panel at the top, the pre-contact dogs between 10,000 to roughly 5,000 BP, we had 68 individuals, and they all had that A2B, that pre-contact dog group or genotype. And so that's in different sites in North America, including the Coster site down in Illinois. And then we go to the second panel, the Paleo Inuit or pre-Inuit dogs, between 5,500 years ago to 500. We find that most of the samples, so there's only 12. Again, these are some of the older samples that we amplified. Most of them had this pre-contact dog haplotype, so showing that they must have come over with that first wave of dogs. And we see incidents of just 2 individuals here that have this more Inuit dog haplotype or genotype. And then when we come down here to the Inuit archaeological dogs between 2,000 to 200 BP, we see that blue color, that that A2A haplotype, the Inuit dog haplotype, just explodes. That it really has just rapidly moved with humans across the Arctic and has kind of taken hold of the dog population. And we see a little bit of the A1B, which is the East Asian dogs, dingoes, and then some of the more historical dogs as well. And then in this last panel, as time is moving on, we're seeing with historical and modern dogs between 3000 BP to present, there's more of this A1A, so the modern Arctic dog haplotype that's kind of taking over, but there still is a little bit of this A2A of this Inuit dog haplotype that we see in Greenland mostly. So essentially, we see temporal and frequency shifts as of this near replacement of the pre-Inuit dogs with this Thule Inuit dog expansion. Okay. And so just kind of going over some of the questions that we had for ourselves is, what is the relationship of pre-Inuit dogs to pre-contact dogs? See that pre-Inuit and pre-contact dogs largely share the same genotype, that they just, again, to show here that it's largely that purple A2B haplotype that is shared by the pre-Inuit and the pre-contact dogs. And then were pre-Inuit dogs founders of Inuit dogs? And it's likely that Inuit dogs are unrelated to these pre-Inuit dogs. Like Chris had mentioned, that it was almost as if they had just completely died out before the Inuit dogs came over. And this Inuit haplotype A2A was found prior to Inuit arrival, again, only in 2 dogs. So it wasn't all that frequent. And then I think the most amazing thing about the study is, like Chris had mentioned, showing that the Inuit people are responsible for expansion of this type of dog, of this incredible sled dog, and they have something so incredible to be proud of. And so are modern Inuit dogs descended from ancient Inuit dogs? Yes. And historical and modern dogs still maintain this Inuit dog haplotype, which is pretty amazing. When I was doing some research of modern dogs, and I would get to tell breeders that, like, oh, your dog has the ancient genotype, they would just be so happy, and it was amazing. And Inuit dogs are one of the last true native North American dogs. I think there's some also, the Chihuahua also holds that
And
that title.
the Xolo Escuitle.
Oh yeah. So Inuit dogs are really special. And unfortunately, we've seen that the arrival of the 3rd and 4th waves of dogs, the European and the gold rush dogs, have replaced the pre-contact lineage. And so with that, just want to thank our funders and people that helped us with all aspects of this project. And then I think we're open for questions.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Chris and Sarah. And this is the time, before we get to the questions, this is the time we ask the Straight Science audience to show a little love in the chat box to the speakers. It is never easy to be a public speaker, ever. I don't care who you are, but unless you're magic, it's never easy to be a straight science speaker or any kind of public speaker. So thank you to Chris and Sarah and her cat, who played a part in tonight's presentation as well. So give a little love to Sarah and Chris as you're thinking up your questions. And Ask away. Oh, you're getting some claps and things. That's nice. Thanks, Kirsten. So I guess I'll open it up. We have a caller on the line. Now, callers in Straight Science, they get a priority because it's never easy to be a caller on any kind of Zoom, right? You can't jump up and down and raise your hand or do the magic. So why don't we let the caller know? Caller, you can go ahead and ask a question at any time. Don't worry about stepping on anybody someone else is talking. You have the priority if you so desire. If you also, for the callers, sometimes it gets gummed up with the UAF account. So you can call. My cell phone is 907-434-1149. And I'm in Anchorage, so I'll get that call. And with the internet, although it sounds like, Kirsten, you're up and running. So give a call or text your question. With that, nothing from the caller. And I think it's *6 actually to unmute. But Charlie, your hand is up. Go ahead. Charlie, your hand is up. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm having trouble unmuting.
Oh,
Okay.
that's okay. Thank you.
Yeah, it was very interesting. I was thinking that you might be able to see some morphological differences in the dogs and the different lineages. And I noticed during the Hope race when true Russian dogs came over to participate in that race, they were much shorter legged. I mean, they all look like sled dogs, but they were a different build than the typical race dog of the Iditarod. And I wondered if you had any observations about the evolution working on the Inuit dog versus something that's bred for racing.
Sarah, did you want to answer this? I can
I'm gonna
briefly.
let you take that, Chris.
Well, I mean, I can briefly say that there isn't a lot of major morphological differences, definitely across the whole Arctic in terms of shapes of the skull and so forth. But one thing that generally characterizes the Inuit dogs versus some of the other dogs like the Huskies and Malamutes is leg length, as you kind of alluded to, because Inuit sled dogs have incredible endurance, but they're not speedy. So they were either intentionally or unintentionally, but they definitely can withstand the cold like no other and can just keep going. And so I'm going to let Sarah, though, speak to one of the things that what she discovered with a lot of the kind of more modern Iditarod dogs in terms of their genetics.
Yeah, we with the modern Iditarod dogs that we were able to sample, we found that there was perhaps unsurprisingly a lot of intermixing with like pointers, Salukis, with dogs that have larger hearts, that would again kind of enhance that endurance, and would allow them to potentially sprint longer, and yeah, ways of trying to increase that performance a little bit. And I can share for a second, maybe. Let me see. I don't know if this would be of interest to people or not, but with talking about the modern dogs, Chris and I and my PhD advisor published a paper 2013, I don't know, 2015
2015.
on on modern dogs, modern Arctic dogs, and found that the Inuit sled dog and the Greenland dog are pretty much one and the same. And that I think the name that we decided on was that they should be called Inuit dogs. And we see that at least with these 5 different breeds, that there is a little bit of intermixing. Let me take a step back here and describe what this is first. So each of these bars that you can see is an individual dog, and it shows the genetic percentage that it belongs to that group. And so like we can see this individual here is mostly orange, so it's mostly Alaskan Husky, and then maybe a quarter or so blue, which is Inuit sled dog. And so you can go through each of these little bars and see kind of where their ancestry is broken up. But yeah, so each of these breeds is pretty much standalone. The fact that we can mostly see just mainly green, mainly orange, with just a little bit of integration between each. But the biggest takeaway from this study was that the Inuit sled dog and Greenland dog were the same.
Thank you. Yeah.
That's pretty interesting, actually. Thanks. All right. Kirsten, your hand is up. You have the floor.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to really give a shout out to the UC Davis Veterinary Genetics Lab. I've had a dog team for about 30 years, and a couple times I had breedings that I wasn't sure who the dad was, and so I was able to send samples from the pups and the dad to confirm like who the dad of the pups was. And it was just such an easy, accessible program. So thank you, UC Davis.
Hey, Kirsten, quick question. Thanks for the shout out. They're very excited about that. But what do you know the genetic makeups? Are you using Inuit sled dogs or
no? Mine are they're Alaskan Huskies.
Okay.
Yeah. So I guess I don't know if the records would still be there if further. Well, I don't. Yeah, to check and see what no, they're Alaskan Huskies. Yeah.
Do you remember when you sent your samples in, or like
probably like 2016, 20. Let's see. So quite a while ago, maybe even as early as 2011, 2012.
We might have included some of those in our study then.
Oh,
because we went through the bank of genetic samples from the VGL, from the Veterinary Genetics Lab.
And that's great to think that maybe my dogs contributed to something.
Yeah, that's so exciting. So cool.
That is cool. Is that you're all set, Kirsten, or you have any other question?
No, I'm good. Thanks.
Okay. There's a question in the chat from Jan Stevens. When do you see Huskies and Malamutes begin to appear?
That is a tough one. I don't necessarily know the answer to that.
Well, they're definitely though not like pre-1700. So we're definitely talking like once you start seeing the gold rush era, this is really when you see this massive integration of Huskies and Malamutes into the region. We did actually include in some of our samples, they were dogs that were found from campsites that were abandoned in maybe the 1920s or 30s. We got these from the University of Arizona, and they all turned out to be Husky and Malamute. So even by that point in Anaktuvuk Pass, in pretty remote area, they were already the kind of Inuit sled dogs had already kind of started to fade out. And what you see kind of what's really interesting is when you looked across on that kind of bar graph that we saw across the Arctic, that the Greenland dogs have the least amount of other breeds in them, the one that Sarah was showing. Yeah, so you see the Greenland dog, there's almost nothing in terms of other dog varieties. The Inuit sled dog has a few little bits of Husky and Malamute in there. And then you see then on the other end, you get little bits of little tiny bit of Inuit dog in the Alaskan Husky, a little tiny bit in the Malamute, but the Siberian Husky is not much. And so, yeah, so it's interesting. Where are the Malamutes from? So that's, I'm gonna, Sarah, where are the Malamutes from originally? My understanding is they're actually Siberian. So all of these, although we're calling them Alaskan Huskies and Siberian Huskies, they would have all come originally from Siberia and would have come from Russian explorers as well as Americans coming into the area. So and so they kind of fit more with you know, they're definitely part of Eastern Asian dogs. And so they're different from the variety that you see, for example, that the Sami up in northern oh, good picture there, up in northern Scandinavia have. Yeah, there you go.
So yeah, I just wanted to show here. So this is a phylogenetic tree showing essentially this group here of the Inuit and the Greenland dog, that they're closer together. They share a most recent common ancestor. And then the Malamute, Alaskan Husky, and Siberian Husky also share a most recent common ancestor and are more related to each other than they are to the Inuit and the Greenland dog.
All of them originate in Siberia, but just have broken off at different times to create these kind of breeds that we would call now. But yeah, as I said, on the other side, if you look in Europe, in the northern sled dog populations in Europe, those would be a very different variety. And that actually was an interesting test that we did. We actually looked at dogs from Norse sites, and we did not find a single Inuit dog. Like, so, you know, in case there was some little interbreeding between Viking dogs and Inuit dogs, there was nothing going on there. So, so yeah, no interaction.
Disappointing.
Yeah, it was very disappointing. I was really hoping to find Inuit dogs in Norse sites and Viking dogs in Inuit sites, but it didn't happen.
I think that sounds actually pretty interesting.
Yeah.
But that they didn't.
Yes,
but,
no, exactly. So
yeah.
there is, and it actually follows the archaeological record really well, that there is very, very little evidence of interaction between those two groups. So they kind of
much bigger Arctic back then than we currently have as far as conditions for cold and distance and things like that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Charlie, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to point out that if you look at historical documents from about 1900, the Malamute people were Eastern Norton Sound and Nulato Hills.
Yeah, so there's a difference though between the Malamute, the actual Inuit people, and what we call the Malamute dog. So so that the dog has been named after the people, but that dog actually came in later and was adopted and became definitely part of Malamute culture, but it was not it was not part of this original Inuit dog population.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Yep.
And there's a question in the chat from Olivia B. What was the difference in domestication timing in Siberia versus Inuit population?
If I think I understand what you're talking about. So some of the very, very earliest sled dogs, so the use of sleds of dogs comes from this site on Zhukov Island in Russia. Doesn't mean that it wasn't happening elsewhere, but that's where our archaeological evidence comes from and our genetic evidence comes from. But those dogs themselves, if we want to go back to kind of original domestication, that goes back to, you know, from wolf populations in both southeastern and southwestern Asia, at least 15,000 years ago. Now, there is some evidence that in Europe there was kind of a little attempt at domestication about 40 to 30,000 or so years ago, where you see a little bit of change in morphology of the dogs from the wolves, but it kind of is like a failed domestication attempt. It's like we tried it, didn't work, kind of moved on from that. But in terms of domestication that stuck and remained, it goes from about 15,000 or so years ago. But as far as people getting to Siberia, those particular populations that we're talking about, you know, we have populations that are ranging into Siberia as early as like 28,000 years ago on the Yana River, and then getting towards more of the eastern part is more like around 20,000 or so years ago. But again, one of the most difficult things is we do not have any evidence that dogs came with kind of the original peopling of the Americas, you know, 15 to 20,000 or so years ago. The dogs seem to have been kind of a later arrival of indigenous dogs.
And just to tack on to that too, that my PhD research showed that based on the genetics, so we use village dogs, so dogs that kind of nobody really owns, they're just kind of hanging around in towns, and so we sampled through Southwest Asia, mainly in Iran, and Jordan and Israel, and then also down in Southeast Asia, island Southeast Asia. And what we surmise is that we think that dogs were originally domesticated in the Middle East, in the Iran area, and then people moved with those proto dogs, so like the first version, dog 1.0, and then moved towards Southeast Asia, kind of as they, sorry, let me back up again. One of the problems I think that that happened with domestication not really kind of taking off is the fact that in Europe and in Southwest Asia, that there was always concentrations of wild wolves that would backcross with these proto dogs, and then it would just kind of, these little like flares that would kind of go off and then would just die. But then once you got to Southeast Asia, where there's no evidence of wolves south of the Yangtze River, that was when dogs were really able to take off. And so that we didn't have much backcrossing anymore with wolves. And so the most recent ancestor to all modern breeds is from Southeast Asia. And so then that's when this like dog 2.0 took off. And then those dogs then spread throughout Siberia into North America, and then back into Europe, back into Southwest Asia as well.
So any follow-up on that? Or you got your question answered? So if for Sarah and for Chris, since Kirsten may have her dogs actually in your study, can you drop in the chat a link to your paper or where a website or something? Just so you know, I would think, I don't know, maybe Kirsten, you're not interested, but that's pretty neat that your dogs may have been part of this this study, and you'll get to see what the results, how that all fits in. So give you more info for your own dogs or for you. Jan Stevens asks, what's next?
For me, unfortunately, nothing dog related, because I work on salmon
At
now,
this
but
time.
I still love dogs. But Chris?
She says with a cat. I'm just saying. Okay.
Yeah, so yeah, this particular project was funded by the two grants from the National Science Foundation that we had in like between like around 2011 to 2014. And it takes a long time though to get like to mass all of that data and get it actually out in the world. But by that point, I was still continuing on in my work, but one thing that happens with postdocs as Sarah moved on to a different postdoc position and then a job because you know you gotta get employment, right? So she now works as a geneticist, but working on, as she said, fish populations. So she's still doing ecology and genetics, just not on Arctic dogs. And we kind of I guess the thing is we've kind of answered the questions that we had about those dogs. And, you know, both from looking at modern dogs and ancient dogs, we've really kind of done at least as much as we really can. And what I think was most satisfying to Sheila Cloutier, the Inuit woman that I mentioned, was that we're able to say, yes, indeed, the modern Inuit dogs that you have in Canada and Greenland are still the same genetic dogs and have had very limited European dog introgression from, you know, at all. And so that was really helpful to them to go back to the Canadian government and say, this is really important for us to protect this dog breed. So there's been a double-edged sword though that's happened recently because the American Kennel Club has finally recognized the Inuit sled dog or the Inuit dog as official breed. But the problem is then now you start getting kind of more commercial breeders starting to breed these dogs and sell these dogs, which then ends up, you know, you end up with other issues that start to happen. And Inuit really wanted to kind of keep this as their dog breed. So, you know, it's like bringing the story to the world also brought other things that came along with it. So, for example, if anyone watches Outlander, that is an Inuit dog that plays Rollo, the dog in the show.
I guess my question then is, how do you know you have an Inuit dog? Is it you because it doesn't look like, or doesn't sound like, maybe I have this wrong, it doesn't sound like you can visually tell, like Charlie was asking about morphometrics. Do you so I mean I Doug, while you were talking, I was like, I was in Chukotka earlier, and I took a picture of a dog, just a sled dog in Lorino, which is just across kind of southwest of Diomede and north of Providenia. And you know, I've got a picture if you want to see this dog, but I was like, well, maybe they'll say it's a Inuit dog, or now I don't know, because it sounds like you have Malamute, and so I don't know if you want to see the dog picture, but it doesn't sound like you can tell visually
Yeah.
that
I
you
don't
have
know.
an Inuit dog, which then says, okay, so if you have all these breeders, they must be doing the genetics then to be able to say, I have a
Yeah.
genetically
Yeah,
distinct
they are. Now,
Inuit dog or Greenland dog.
no, there's the thing where, so in Greenland, this is actually something that's quite important to Greenland Inuit, is maintaining this breed. And so they're pretty
Genetically.
strict genetically,
Yeah,
and so they were very
distinct.
strict, and that's why you really see they're pretty kind of, I hate to say clean in terms of their genetics. And
Okay.
and that's also because they want to prevent any sort of epidemics coming in, and so they don't you cannot bring other dogs in that might potentially get into their dog populations, and it doesn't matter
The
what
Greenland dog.
the Greenland dogs. That's more
Greenland dog.
difficult to do in Canada. But a lot of the smaller communities in, you know, on Baffin Island and in northern Quebec, which is where kind of the largest population of Inuit sled dogs are, they do still also try to prevent anyone from bringing in dogs from elsewhere. Now, you don't see the same thing if you go to a lot of villages in Labrador. The village dogs in Labrador are kind of reminding me of the village dogs in Shaktoolik.
Eastern Canada.
Yeah, in Labrador and Eastern Canada, they kind of look like the dogs in Shaktoolik, where you'll see, like, you know, the little dog in Shaktoolik will walk. He looks like a lab, but he's got little short legs. And so there's been just a whole hodgepodge of mixture happening in a lot of the villages now. So yeah, it is kind of up to the breeder to kind of prevent that, and it's difficult. Yeah.
So okay, well, that's very interesting right there in itself. So the Greenland dog is sort of more, sounds like genetically pure at this
Yeah.
point.
Yeah.
And the Inuit dog, which is commercially available, is potentially
The
more
one coming from Canada is now
Canada.
and
Good on Canada. They know how to hold on to their own. So
yeah, and
that's
they're kind of again grappling with this whole people really want to have this Inuit dog because it looks
sure.
like a
Sounds
wolf.
awesome. Yeah.
And so they're asking for this breed, and it's hard to say no if somebody's paying you money for this dog. But at the same time, it does start to affect the, the long-term population.
Right.
So, and again, like, we were talking about with the Malamutes and the Huskies, those are not yes, they're indigenous dogs in the sense that they've been part of indigenous culture for the last 200 or so years, but not in the sense that they came with the Inuit people from Siberia, and are part of that original population. So, and again, that's kind of that whole thing of like, what is tradition? Because tradition can still be something that is the last 200 years. So I definitely do not want anybody to have anybody think that their Malamutes are not their, their historical dog, because it has been part of their culture for a long time. Yeah.
All right. Any other questions or comments? We're on the getting on the 7:50 mark, so I just want to make sure everybody we respect everybody's time. And unless there's any other questions and comments, I'll give a little shout out for next week's Straight Science, and then Chris and Sarah, if you guys want to stay on just for a sec, that'd be great. And so for next week, Straight Science is going to be on February 6th, which will be a Thursday, next Thursday. And this is going to be, I wouldn't normally go out of the region, but this is going to be some work that was done on walruses, and walruses are everything to the Bering Strait region. This is Point Lay, some teamwork between federal biologists, walrus biologists, and residents of Point Lay, which is up the coast in the North Slope Borough. And they formed a partnership and went and did some aerial survey work on, oh, Chris, all right, well, you'll see you next week. So there was partner work on some drone research, some other research. We'll hear all about it. I don't even know all about it, except it's really based on some teamwork given approach at Point Lay. And we really appreciate that, not only walrus, but also teamwork. So with that, we'll see you. Thank you again for a really nice night talking about dogs. I hope the serum run week is going well in Nome this week. And with that, we'll say good night, and we'll see you all next week. Have a good night, everybody.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.